a lot of people want rights of nature to be this thing where we can achieve dramatic revolutionary transformation of society without any confrontation, without anything dangerous, without any risk, without actually standing up to those in power.
Yeah.
You know, we can just get a bunch of people together and hold some nice meetings and get signatures and petitions and get things on the ballot and get laws passed, and then it will all change. And that's not true.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Max Wilbert. Max is an author and a long-time organizer who has built up social movements and participated in direct action against empire and the destruction of our environment. Now a community organizer at CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, Max is working with communities on the ground to build resilience and resistance, weaving the nets that can catch us as empire continues to crumble. This is Max's second time on the show, and I invited him back to talk about a new bill that's being passed through New York that would give rights of nature to all of the water in the state, which CELDF helped draft, and to discuss how important it is that communities take action to secure their futures, build relationships between themselves, and protect their local environments. This conversation wanders like a river. We talk about violence, defense, boundaries, how to work together. We talk about peasantry, patriarchy, moving from understanding to action, the enclosure of the commons, and how to work together to defend what is ours collectively, the only known expression of life in the universe, suffering hundreds if not thousands of years of violence and destruction, and the faith that it demands in human beings in order to keep resisting, to keep marching, to keep dreaming what could be. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Max, welcome back to Planet Critical. It's such a pleasure to speak with you again.
It's a joy to be here, Rachel. Thank you.
I actually can't remember if I had this question back at the time. And I probably should have gone and listened just in case and to see how your answer would have evolved. But I'm going to hit you with it now. Why is the world in crisis?
That's, in some ways, the biggest question of them all. In other ways, it's a question that I've somewhat come to de-emphasize in my own work. You know, when I was younger and I really got started with radical politics and diving into environmentalism and feminism and anti-racist politics and anti-war, anti-imperialism, all these things, it was so important to me to understand why. You know, I was the 7-year-old kid. Why? And I do think it's very important, but at the same time, as I did all that research and reading, as I talked to people and explored and tried to answer that question, why, the answers just kept going further and further back in history. And they just kind of extended back into the mists of prehistory, into these, you know, the destruction of the planet is not a new thing. And a lot of people like to start at the Industrial Revolution. But the truth is, Europe was deforested entirely before the Industrial Revolution, well before. So was North Africa. So was the entire Middle East. And that's true of large areas of the planet where we've seen major environmental destruction going back centuries, sometimes even millennia. some people take a very jaded attitude when they hear that, and they just say, well, humans are evil, we're destructive. And of course, that's not true. I don't need to tell you this. I don't need to tell probably many of the listeners this, because if you look around the world, there are countless examples of communities which haven't destroyed their environment over the long term. Or in many cases, there are examples of communities of humans that came into an area, they caused a disruption when they arrived, because humans, being apex predators like orca whales or wolves, like, we caused change. All creatures cause change when they come into an environment for the first time. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's the process of evolution and life changing on the planet. But what sustainable cultures do is they learn. They learn over time, how do we fit in? How do we live here? How do we live in balance with this place? And, the same can be said of other species. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote in Braiding Sweetgrass about plantain, this plant called plantain. And it's a very useful medicinal plant, herbal medicine. And it came over with white settlers when they came over from Europe. And she writes about how that plant became very useful to native people very quickly, and how, in her language, it sort of developed a way of fitting in. It didn't take over ecosystems everywhere it went. It didn't push other life forms out. It just sort of found little places where it could thrive alongside the other life forms that were already there. And there are countless human communities that have managed to do this. I'm here in Oregon, in traditional territory of the Kalapuya people. And when the first European settlers arrived here in the mid-1800s, this place was really an ecological paradise. It's not an overstatement to say that. There were millions of salmon in the rivers. There were huge herds of elk. There were grizzly bears. There were wolves. There were vast swaths of old-growth forest. And, at least to some extent, that ecological health was the result of deliberate choices that those communities made. Humans have a lot of power. We have a lot of intelligence. We have these opposable thumbs. We can destroy the entire world, as we're seeing. We can decimate entire ecosystems. We can do all these things. But just because we can doesn't mean we should, of course. And this is the lesson that nobody in Silicon Valley, nobody in the industrial centers of the world has learned. Just because we can doesn't mean that we should. And that is a lesson that most of our ancestors throughout human history have really taken to heart, that has been part of these knowledge systems around the world. I was talking to a man named Paul Winnie, who's an elder in the Tonawanda Seneca Nation, a couple weeks ago. And we were talking about part of what we're going to talk about today, which is this rights of nature law, or attempt to pass a rights of nature law in the state of New York. And, he was just saying it's all about balance and connection to nature. It's all about figuring out how to live in balance. And that's an active process. You don't just sort of accidentally stumble into it. And this is, if you look at the mythologies, the oral histories, the cultures of sustainable communities around the world throughout human history and today, whether we're talking about indigenous people or we're talking about horticultural societies, pastoralists, all kinds of communities that have figured out how to live in balance. They have these stories, they have rituals, they have rules and traditions that help people to make the right decisions on an ongoing basis, that help people to live in balance on an ongoing basis. So why are we in crisis? It's a long answer. I think it's the way that I answer that question in part is that we all have within us the capacity to do great evil, to do bad things. We all have within us the capability to destroy the planet, to act in uncaring ways, to act out, aggressive, domineering forms of violence. That capability exists in all people. But what comes out, what we actually act on, that's what matters. And, if we create nourishing cultures and communities that reward and honor when people act in certain ways, then we're going to get that kind of behavior. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in today. So why are we in crisis? The short answer, because destroying the planet, acting in ways that are imperialistic, that are oppressive, that are domineering, those types of actions are rewarded in our society and in our world today. And they're rewarded financially, they're rewarded socially and politically in many cases. And so we come to a world in which we're ruled by sociopaths.
Yeah. I've been thinking recently about this sort of inverse relationship, and I'm not sure if that's the right term, between like doing harm and doing good, and how in a biological world and a physical world in which life is essentially the expression of the relationships between things and the systems that we live in, it takes so much, it literally takes so much time and a relatively small amount of energy, but so much time to make good. Like if you think about, the calories it creates to bring a new human life into the world, or to grow trees, and how like the new life starts from like the smallest of things. And really what's happening there is it needs time and it needs other things to build relationships with and weave with. Whereas on the other hand, destruction is instant. You can destroy an entire forest that took thousands and thousands and thousands of years to come together in a year. And it takes like a big amount of energy, kind of like there's a big energy investment sort of upfront, but the fact that it can happen like that, like you can create death almost instantly, and it takes time to create life. And it's kind of helped me think about why is it as well that death is so heavily rewarded in this system, just because it's like the easiest thing. It's this constantly easy thing to do, especially under a system of violence. And I believe that Marx wrote about this as well, like these economies of death, essentially. And it's sort of like a child getting bored of a toy and breaking a thing, or, maybe that, like a child breaking a thing just to see something happen, rather than going through the more difficult imaginative process of like building a world in her head, for example. That's what I've been thinking about recently.
Somebody told me a story a while back from grandmother Agnes Baker Pilgrim, who is one of the Council of Indigenous Grandmothers. She was from Grants Pass, Oregon, which is just a few hours south of where I live. She was Tekelma. And she talked about how the most important journey that we can make in our lives is 12 inches, and it's the journey from the head to the heart. And that is the journey of slowing down. Yeah. That is the journey of, learning delayed gratification, learning patience, learning wisdom, and that's growing up, basically. We live in a world, like I said, dominated by sociopaths, but probably a more nuanced way of saying that would be we live in a world that's dominated by people who never grew out of their adolescent stage, and not a healthy adolescent stage, but a pathological adolescent stage. And these are the people who are largely running the world right now. And this is a serious problem. I mean, this is, I think, part of what comes about when patriarchy sort of becomes the dominant ideology of an entire global society, more or less, and rules for decades or centuries. Is you get this world in which almost all men, but also a few women leaders around the world too, and women CEOs and so on, are playing out these sort of pathological adolescent scenarios. Like it's not, I don't mean to minimize it by saying that, because these obviously aren't just psychological issues. These have real material, physical consequences. We're talking about people who are commanding entire economies and entire armies, and who are leading us into an ecological apocalypse deeper and deeper every day, who are perpetuating a genocide in Gaza, who are, doing all these atrocities. And yet at the root, in a way, it is this very twisted individual psychology. But, these are systemic problems too, because those are the people who rise to the top. Because like I said, it's the behavior that gets rewarded. There's a reason why Trump is the president now, and it's because he's the perfect president for the psyche of the nation in large part. Like, he is the shadow, he is the expression of the shadow. And a lot of liberals, especially in the United States, like to sort of clutch their pearls about Trump. Maybe that's a patriarchal saying. Maybe, I don't know the history of that one. But like to sort of act all surprised and shocked by how awful Trump is. But he is that shadow, and I know this is something we talked about a little bit in our last conversation, is sort of the legacy of these traumas that have come through not just, the genocide of Native people and slavery of African Americans and, all the abuses of immigrants over the decades and centuries. I'm speaking from the U.S. context, but I know there's parallels elsewhere around the world as well. But also the trauma that comes on the part of the perpetrators of those, of those things. And, what is patriarchy but the shaping of the male psyche into the psyche of soldier, of warrior, of traumatizer, of someone who shuts off and buries every emotion they have, who only sees personal relationships in terms of how do I gain advantage, how do I take advantage. And that is, that's really the destruction of the human spirit. But that's the world we live in right now.
I read The New Age of Sexism by Laura Bates last week, which tracks how misogyny is on the rise, being perpetrated in a new manner due to digital technologies, which are essentially, she's arguing, like being built by hugely sexist people, and thus sexism exists in these technologies. And she quoted a study that a third of men in the United States self-reported a questionnaire that they would rape a woman if they thought that they would get away with it. They would have sex with a woman against her consent if they thought that there would be no repercussions and nobody would ever find out. And that is a deeply, deeply disturbing statistic that I would hope illustrates the point that you have made just then, that patriarchy is a culture of entitlement, it's a culture of access, it's a culture of taking, it's a culture of this patho-adolescence of whatever need I have ought to be fulfilled, and I will use whatever body is in my path in order to fulfill it. And thus the people that are driving us towards this ecological apocalypse are just like those men self-reporting on the questionnaire, in that they're actually not doing anything apart from being expressions of this culture. And so there's not much leadership going on, And I think that's what I find so particularly interesting, especially sometimes when kind of on the online left, I think I'm going to start using that more and more often. On the online left, there's this sort of rhetoric, I would say, that there are these like very dangerous people who are in these positions of power that are enacting these like systems of violence that would not be violent if those people were not there, or could be reformed. Like, that's the implication. No. Yeah. These people are not doing anything particularly out of the ordinary. Bibi's genocide in Gaza is absolutely horrific. It is one of 3 genocides that I can think of that are currently ongoing in this world, and one of 10 over the past century. The atrocities that are being committed does not make them horrific in the sense that they are abnormal. Like, this is fundamentally what these systems are built on, like the exploitation the abuse, the extraction of bodies, human bodies, earth bodies.
Yeah.
And so these people are just doing whatever anybody almost would do in their position of power. They're not leaders. They're not special. There's no great goal. Anyone that is acting in a way to further perpetuate the system of like hyper-technologized patriarchy is bereft of imagination, analysis, and intelligence.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote from Frank Herbert, who is the author of Dune. And he said, all governments suffer a recurring problem. Power attracts pathological personalities. It's not that power corrupts, but that it is magnetic to the corruptible. Such people have a tendency to become drunk on violence, a condition to which they are quickly addicted.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
But I think you're right. And the systemic nature of these things is so often overlooked. And, another book that I was reading a while ago is actually a fiction book, kind of a climate fiction book about intelligent octopuses.
Lovely.
It was fun. It was a strange read. But, one of the quotes that I pulled out of that book was something like, when you invent the drone, you invent drone warfare. Right? That when you invent the nuclear reactor, you invent nuclear weapons. Like that there are unintended consequences to these things. And in a sense, this is why the mythology of Pandora's box is such an enduring story, like all powerful mythology that's endured for thousands of years, because it really says something true. Like once that box is open, once that knowledge comes out into the world, it's very dangerous, and I may have told this story last time that we spoke, but I'm reminded of Martin Prechtel was adopted into the Zutuhil Mayan community. I think I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Apologies if not. But he tells of how in that community, the traditional way, the old way, is if you're going to do something like make a knife, right? You're going to melt down some old scrap metal or something you have lying around, probably traded all over the continent already at that point, and you're going to form it into a knife. That process in their tradition involves a lot of prayers, a lot of sacrifices. It's a very slow, lengthy, arduous process. You have to pay for that knife. And in part, he says it's because it's a recognition of the power that a knife represents. It's a recognition that a knife can cut, a knife can kill, a knife can slice, can sever. And it's not something to be taken lightly. I mean, this is why when, I've got young nephews, one of the older ones, 7. And, we're going camping this summer. And last summer, I let him use my pocket knife for the first time, like a real, sizable knife. And before I did, he's like any kids, he can be crazy at times and jump around. And I sat him down and I got real serious. And I said, these are the rules. This is, and if you don't follow the rules, I'll take it away immediately and you won't get to use it again until, I think it's the right time. And, and he listened very intently because he wanted to use it because it makes him feel adult. He wants to craft and carve wood and whatever. This is what's not happening in the world today. AI, nobody sat down the AI creators and said to them, look, and nobody had that conversation. Nobody had the precautionary principle conversation with them. Or if they did, they were kind of ignored. Like there was a great book a while ago. It was written by, maybe you know who I'm talking about. He was that British journalist who, I think he was kind of controversial for something or other, but he wrote a big book about screen time and screen culture.
Johann Hari?
Is that his name?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I read his book about screen culture, and he interviews the engineer, the computer coder who invented endless scrolling. So he actually wrote the code for the first time that enabled you to just keep scrolling down a page. Because before that, you had to actually click or tap, next page.
Oh, wow.
And he's, in the book, what he says is, I'm terrified at what I've created. But he also says, if I didn't make it, somebody else would have. Like the momentum was right there.
Yeah.
I don't think he was saying that necessarily as like a self-exculpation,
Okay.
at least not entirely. But I think he was pointing to something honest. That's like there's this momentum that forms behind these things. And, but that is what everyone says. If we don't build it, somebody else will. And, then they'll get the advantage over us, right?
Totally.
Because it's all about jockeying for position.
There is a sense of inevitability, I feel, about where we are. And I'm not sure how much that is an, ever increasing awareness of the millennia, really, of human systems that have brought us here, or my own sort of, pathology for drama or helplessness, or maybe it's a mix of all of them, but there does really seem to be, for those of us kind of at the on the very edges of research, just this sense amongst all of us of, like this was always going to happen this way, because power has been so centralized that there really is no way to now wrest it back. There probably is no kind of social uprising or increased consciousness that could flip power in a way that certainly, the peasant revolts of the 14th and 15th century did have, a good effect. Even the labor movement of the 80s. But there's something about this profound relationship with technology and the extent of globalization that now means that the citizens of the wealthiest countries in the world, pretty much all of us, are now fundamentally dependent on this continuing system of violence in order for us to survive. And so that is what feeds the sense of inevitability of there is very little to push back again. Pushing back is sort of a veil, or eventually you reach the mirror. It's pushing back on oneself that humans, especially in this culture, are not particularly good at doing. And so to me, it's very interesting that a lot of people are reaching this position of, okay, it's not about how do we restructure power, how do we restructure our energy systems. It's not about that right now. It's about how do we restructure our communities. What do we do within them that creates the safety nets to catch people, the exit ramps when things start, increasingly fray? What are the networks of relationships that will allow people to move through what is coming with at least a semblance of grace? And that is the work that you are doing now. And I'd really love to learn more about it. And perhaps you could also, because I said that we would talk about this, so we should talk about it because I think people would be very interested. Why is it that the organization you are now working with kind of spent 20 years focusing on the rights of natures as their fundamental strategy and have recently pivoted to add in this community resilience element?
Yeah. Well, for those who aren't aware, I picked up some work with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. It's called CELDF, back late 2024. And there are folks who I've been aware of for many years. I've sort of been friends with and been on the fringes of some of their efforts in the past. But that organization was really one of the first, if not the first, in the United States to bring forward this rights of nature paradigm. I think it was back in 2002 that they helped a community write and pass a first local law challenging corporate rights as sort of an idea in itself. And then in 2007, they helped a little tiny town in Pennsylvania, a pretty conservative place actually, pass the first rights of nature law under the U.S. legal system. And as far as we understand, it's the first in any Western legal system. The general concept of nature having rights is not a new thing. It goes back in many cultures for centuries and millennia. But this was the first time it was sort of written down and codified in a Western legal system. And so the organization went on to sort of spend 20 years focusing on this. And in that time, CELDF helped dozens of communities write and enact these rights of nature laws. And usually how it would happen was a community would be facing some destructive thing like fracking coming into their town, or a toxic waste dump, or a pipeline, or whatever it was. And they would be looking for help. And usually they'd reach out to the big greens. and they would just get crickets because those organizations generally don't get involved much in grassroots work, unfortunately. And so eventually they'd reach out to CELDF, and CELDF would respond, and the community would usually say, we want your help. We're looking for lawyers to help us appeal the permits or file a lawsuit against this project. And CELDF's legal team and organizers would go to them and say, look, we don't actually recommend going down that route of the lawsuits and challenging the permits, because that system is set up for you to fail. It's set up to waste a lot of your time and energy. And at the end of the day, the best case scenario is that the permit gets temporarily canceled and the company has to go back and rework it and then resubmit it. And if they fix whatever error they made that's violating Regulation 42B, then their project can go forward. That's what the law says. Yeah. And a lot of communities, didn't like to hear that, but some of them listened. And so they said, okay, what can we do instead? And CELDF people would say, well, you can take this approach. And, this isn't a silver bullet. We don't have a silver bullet for you. But what we can offer you is this sort of community rights of nature model, which at its core is we call it collective municipal civil disobedience. So it's a form of collectively as a community, rather than just a few people going out and blocking a project. It's a form of, as a whole community, we are choosing to break higher laws in this country, state laws, federal laws, even the Constitution, and say those laws are unjust. We're passing our own law here in which we are asserting that that our river deserves protection, that our forest deserves to stay standing, that our drinking water needs to be clean, that the ground should not be polluted and destroyed by these fracking wells, by these mines, and so on. And it's just a form of communities. It's a way for communities to stand up and assert, these are our values. This is what we stand for. This is what we believe in. And it's quite interesting because, polls show all, across the country, again, I'm most familiar with the US, but most people actually really support environmental protection. It's quite a popular thing. And so, our environment doesn't get protected, and it's because we don't live in a functioning democracy. And it never has been that way. So part of what CELDF would do is go into these communities and educate them and say, let's look at the Constitution. Let's go back and look at the Federalists and how they came in and actually inserted language into the Constitution that basically undermined all of the actual radical stuff that was in the Constitution when it was first drafted, and turned it into a property first, powerful, become more powerful document. And that's the law of the land in this nation. And a lot of people have been taught in this country that we live in a democracy, that it's the best country on the planet, that we have decision-making power, that we have freedom, and it's just not true. Yeah. So by disabusing people of this notion, and by providing them with another avenue to stand up and say, look, this is what we are asserting. We're asserting fundamental rights to self-determination, fundamental rights to make our own decisions as a community. And, in some cases, this has actually worked. One example is another community in Pennsylvania, Grant Township, which has been in a fight for, a decade now against a fracking well in their small community. So they passed a rights of nature law. The state Department of Environmental Protection sued the town saying that their environmental protection law was illegal.
Wow.
So there's still legal actions ongoing around this case. CELDF lawyers are still kind of trying to help defend the community. But the company backed out after years because it just became clear this community wasn't going to, I can swear on your show, right? They weren't gonna fucking give up. Like they just weren't, they were gonna do everything they could to stop this project. And that's what rights of nature is to me. It's not a silver bullet. It's not this a lot of people want rights of nature to be this thing where we can achieve dramatic revolutionary transformation of society without any confrontation, without anything dangerous, without any risk, without actually standing up to those in power.
Yeah.
You know, we can just get a bunch of people together and hold some nice meetings and get signatures and petitions and get things on the ballot and get laws passed, and then it will all change. And that's not true.
Yeah.
What will happen is what has happened in most of the communities where CELDF has worked, which is the community will do those things I just talked about. They'll get a bunch of signatures, get a rights of nature law on the local ballot, get it passed, and then the state will turn around and sue the local community and say, you can't do that.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to have local democracy. It's actually illegal for you to make that decision. And in several states, Ohio, Florida, and Utah, the state legislatures have actually banned rights of nature laws entirely at the state level. So they preemptively said no communities are allowed to pass rights of nature laws. And this is what's called ceiling preemption. I'll get into sorry, this will be the boring part. I'm going to get into the legal details for a second because I think it's important. A lot of people, their big objection to this is like, isn't this like how the South wanted segregation? They wanted local control, and then the federal government had to step in and say, we're setting federal laws to establish civil rights, and you can't have segregated schools and so on, right?
Oh, what?
States' rights has been a big thing for the right wing when they weren't in power in the United States. And so a lot of people see this attempt to do local democracy, and they get scared of it because they say, won't people just pass laws in their communities saying our minimum wage here is $2 an hour, our environmental protection, we're going to dismantle environmental protections in our community. And the response to that is that the way our organization has approached it is there's two different ways you can look at this. There's the ceiling and the floor. And there should be a floor on protections, right? There should be laws. If we're going to have a government, if the government is going to exist, it's a good idea to have laws like minimum wage laws, right? It's a good idea to have laws that say you can't have child labor, that you can't have segregated schools, et cetera, right? Those are floors. They're setting a floor. You have to be better than this, right? The other kind of preemption is ceiling preemption, which says you can't do any more than this. Those are laws that say you can't pass environmental regulations that are stricter than what we have. You can't pass minimum wage laws that are stricter at the local level, that are higher than what we have at the state level or at the federal level. And that is unjust. That's just a way of shutting down local decision-making processes. So this is all a long story, but CELDF has been doing this work, like I said, for 20 years. And we've had some victories, but we've had a lot of losses. The industry, the corporations that we've been in fights with, they've taken this very seriously. They have, worked with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They've worked with chambers of commerce. They've worked with the oil and gas industry. They've worked with all these corporate players to try and ban rights of nature, to sue the communities that pass these laws, to try and overturn them at every opportunity, because they see this sort of organic uprising of people trying to do democracy. And that's profoundly dangerous if you're in power, right? And that has made the rights of nature work very challenging. And this is getting back to what you were just talking about a minute ago, Rachel, that many people are seeing that work within the existing systems is becoming increasingly irrelevant as those systems are fraying and crumbling and becoming increasingly unstable and changeable and mutable. So at the organization I'm with, CELDF, we're in this middle place right now where we're still promoting rights of nature work. We're still doing a lot of work in that arena. Most recently, we helped draft a law that's in the New York State legislature right now. It's in committee for discussion right now, that would establish rights of nature for all the water in New York State. So it's called the Great Lakes and New York Waters Bill of Rights. And it says that these waters would have the right to exist, persist, flourish, naturally evolve, regenerate, and be restored. It says that that communities can pass laws protecting these ecosystems. It says that that everyone in the state of New York has the right to a healthy and clean environment. And it establishes the right to a freedom from toxic trespass, which is this idea that if you're a corporation and you make whatever, DDT or some toxic chemical, and it ends up in my body, you've trespassed.
Oh, nice.
You have committed trespass on me. So this law would establish that and allow people to, it would establish a cause of action for people to sue, for people to legally go after these corporations. And this law would also prohibit the monetization of any water in New York State. So, laws like this are not perfect. They're not meant to solve every problem. They're works in progress. Like, this is actually the second version of this law. The first version was introduced a couple years ago. People had some criticisms of it. And so we went back to the drawing board, talked to a lot of allies and people in the community, made some changes, and then brought it back in. So we're still doing this rights of nature work because we see it's important as a vehicle, as an approach, as an angle on cultural change. Just introducing these ideas into the public consciousness. Even if this law never gets passed, the fact that the idea of rights of nature is circulating in public discourse, that there's articles about it, that there's news stories about it, even if people are opposed to it, we, in some ways, we liken it to one of the parallels we make is the abolition of slavery movement, because that was the last time in U.S. law that you had a big expansion of rights, right? So you had formerly enslaved people who had no rights. They didn't have voting rights. They didn't have property rights. They didn't have all these different rights. Freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all these different things. And when slavery was abolished, rights were expanded. The scope of who is considered to have valid rights was expanded. And, it's been messy and a bumpy road, obviously. It's not like racism is gone. And it's not like if rights of nature laws passed, then the destruction of nature would be gone. But it is an attempt to recognize within the society, as the great feminist legal scholar Catherine McKinnon once said, law organizes power. And so it's an attempt to recognize in law that we honor and we seek to protect the natural world, and we take that seriously. And so I look at it as sort of an insurgent lawmaking attempt. It's a shot across the bow of the system as it exists. But alongside this, like I was saying, these systems are not stable. They're not reliable. Yeah. And, frankly, a lot of us don't want these systems to be here. Even those of us who do recognize that they sure seem more flimsy than ever before. So that's why this organization, CELDF, is kind of pivoting to include this new program, this new area of focus, which is called community resistance and resilience, which is my main focus at CELDF. And it's really similar to the work that I've been doing for many years now and that we discussed last time I was on your show. It's about recognizing that we're in an empire that's in terminal decline, that is lashing out all over the world, that is destroying, human and non-human life everywhere it goes, that empire needs to be confronted and dismantled. And that at the same time, we need to be building alternatives and demonstrating that there are other ways to live, that there's a symbiosis between resistance and resilience, that these can be mutually reinforcing processes. And so, this is a new program at this group, but like I said, it's work that I've been doing for many years, so I've been kind of able to come on board and plug right in with the networks of people I've been working with for many years, the allies and communities, and we're working on how do we try to work as a connector between different movements, different groups, organizations, and because we're a small group, we can't do everything ourselves. But one thing that we see is this lack of coordination and communication between people who are working in different arenas. And so that's an area where we see that we could step in and do something that's valuable in service to the whole movement and our shared goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I think it's so great. I mean, there was a part of the thinking there is why we launched Planet Coordinate in December to go off and make these films about communities that are on the front lines, actively building resilience and, resisting, to try and be like, what are they doing? How can it be emulated? How can we hook them up with other people who are doing things because we have learned so many lessons around the world. The problem is that our information system isn't centralized as a resistance group, or rather that there are not these sort of bridges between nodes of information. And I think that, for me now, it just seems like the only way through, because the kind of world that is sustainable, and we're going to get a lot of flack from some for going to go down this avenue, but the only world that is sustainable is one that is hyper-localized. And that doesn't mean that people live sort of, primitively, quote unquote, but it just means literally being in relationship with your environment and having your culture and your food and your capacities informed by what is available to you and around you, and what you can take in literally in a sustainable manner that still allows Earth to regenerate. And there can still be hyper technologized, parts of global, society. I read Feminism or Death, and in the last chapter, she references a short story that was written in the 80s by this women sci-fi writer. And the world that she envisioned was a very slow local world where most people were still using horses to get around and growing their own food, being in relationship. And yet, if a child is sick on one side of the world, they can get a supersonic jet, and deliver the medication within 30 minutes. Still having this access to things that are life-saving or helpful, but not using them all the time, not just having this gluttonous relationship to energy. And so it seems to me that that really is where whatever future that will also be beneficial to humans, that will allow us to be well in our bodies and in our minds by being literally present where we are. And so why not start building that as well? Because if that is what all of the signs point to with regards to how is it that people can live well, well, we know that we did that experiment for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And if resistance by way of kind of getting out onto the streets and asking for reform, it's demanding, quote unquote, but it's asking, really. If that's not working, then why not start doing the thing that we want to head towards anyway, and see what that manifests. And I had Sarah Stein-Lebrano on the show recently, and she was talking about how people that are activists are much happier and more fulfilled. People that are actively engaged in their communities, it gives them a sense of fulfillment and well-being in the world in comparison with, others who are not. And so we really are in a case of how is it that we live well? How is it that we live healthfully in this world? And resistance is a good option if you want to have a better life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's funny for me to say this on a platform where, you're podcasting and I'm coming on your show, but I think that it needs to go so far beyond the talking and the content production that it so defines the modern internet. I mean, I do that too. I think it's important for us to talk and spread information and educate and outreach and so on. But it really changes when you are doing something physically with your body out in the world. And, back to, the point about the need for interconnection that you were making, I think that that's so critical. You know, I think back to being out at Thacker Pass and fighting this, big open pit mine and battling this corporation. And just when you're in the trenches of a fight like that, you don't have the bandwidth to think about building coalitions, to think about outreach to allies, to think about how do we, sort of work across issues here and bring in other people. How do we, you don't have any time or energy for those big picture questions. You're just dealing with the crises. You're dealing with the immediate strategic needs of the moment. And so recently, there were some folks who launched a tree sit up in Washington State to try and stop a logging project up there. And one of the ways that I was trying to help was to be that offsite person who understands what it's like to be involved in frontline direct action campaigns, who knows what the demands and stresses of those moments can be like, and who can help with channeling information and communications and strategy and giving feedback and sort of trying to provide some contextualized information at the moments where it's useful to the people who are on the ground, and this is the type of thing that I think is so often lost in our movements is we tend to be so reactive, that, and I'm thinking too, again, to respond to the point you just made, Rachel, about sort of building something. I'm doing a master's in degrowth right now. I'm just finishing up. And it's quite interesting. There's a lot of, the degrowth movement is a broad umbrella, and there's a lot of folks and perspectives within it that I have some pretty strong disagreements with, but there's awesome people and stuff in it with as well. And I went into it because I was just thinking like, look, this is a community of people who are taking it as a baseline that like the scale is not working here, that we need to scale down dramatically. And if that's the baseline, like that's a reasonable place to start. From there, there's a lot of conversations to be had about how to do it and what to focus on and equity and justice and all these different things. And those are important conversations. But if that's your starting point, like that's meeting the moment in a way that that at least is reasonable, right? Which goes so far beyond where most politics is today. But anyway, in my class, this woman was saying that she had a professor who I think was from Uruguay or somewhere in South America. And the last day of the class, this professor kind of went on a rant and was talking about how, you Americans, you people from the U.S., you're really good at analyzing the problems, but you are terrible at solutions. You're very terrible at sitting down and trying to make forward progress and creating something and being generative. And that really feels like a place of learning and an edge for me, because so much of my work for a decade, 15 years, going on 20 years now, has been about, let's look at empire. Let's look at the structure of the power system of industrial civilization, and how do we dismantle that? How do we actually undermine and interdict and undercut and sabotage and dismantle that system, in a very physical, strategic, confrontational way. And, I still think that that's incredibly important. And I think it's very much overlooked, especially, in the West, where, like you said earlier, we're all dependent on this system. And I think one of the reasons it's overlooked is because when it is talked about, it's rarely tied to the building up of the alternatives and the building up of the localized food systems, of the alternative ways of life. I think if we had degrowth-based communities all over the country, all over the world, that were sort of beginning to implement these ways of life, like here, now, like not waiting for the future, but being like, the time is now. Like we need to dramatically change the way we live, starting in our communities. And these places can be fertile soil. They can be nurturing places for the resistance that's going to help dismantle this industrial system. It's going to help, hospice modernity, as, the book says, and sort of help the system to die that needs to die, that's already dying. but that is sort of thrashing and causing so much destruction on its way out. And so that, like I said, that's a frontier for me. And I just was reading the latest Adbusters magazine. Do you know Adbusters?
I don't know.
They're a pretty cool group. They've been around for a long time. What they're most famous for is they actually sparked the whole Occupy Wall Street thing.
Okay.
They were the people who put out the first call, meet at Zuccotti Park and whenever, 2010 or whenever that was, 2011. And, but they're this sort of creative, artistic, culture jamming. I mean, you can tell from the name Adbusters. It's a lot. It started with taking advertising and sort of deconstructing it in these creative, artistic ways and teasing out the messages and undermining them. And they put out this magazine, and one of the things they were talking about was, about getting people to divest their money from 401ks and investments and these types of things, and instead putting that money into their communities. And what would that look like if we really started doing that seriously in our worlds, where we were like, okay, it's for real. This system's done.
Yeah.
We're not participating in this anymore.
Yeah.
My retirement is not going to be a payout from some whatever firm. It's going to be, I invested my money in helping to build a local, sustainable, small scale, permaculture, perennial polycultural, regenerative, farming communities, here, or social housing cooperatives, or, all these different types of local initiatives. And my retirement is going to be that community. My retirement is us taking care of each other as the system crumbles more and more. And, I'm poor. I don't have any money in retirement. So that doesn't really apply to me, but I'm just thinking about it. And I'm thinking about the building side of things, and we have seen this happening in some areas around the world. We've seen some really cool, inspiring examples of this starting to happen. Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, this community coming out of sort of a Black liberation movement history in the heart of the Deep South, and building up on these sort of eco-socialist principles to establish social housing and different cooperative businesses and sort of small-scale enterprises, all run as cooperatives, not for profit, to sort of create in the real time, here and now, an alternative to industrial capitalism. And it's not perfect. It's not pure. It's not, it's not utopian. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
They're facing down the forces of gentrification and the property owners and the capitalist ruling class in their communities. But they're doing it, right? They're not just waiting for the glorious moment when the revolution will come. They're doing something now.
Yeah.
And, and I think that's important.
Something that I hear a lot of with people that are sort of facing this reality of the future's not coming, we have to build it, is that sense of not quite being able to make the jump off point. Knowing, but still waiting and really struggling to kind of understand why, if I firmly believe X, Y, and Z is likely to happen, and that also, even if X, Y, and Z didn't happen, if for whatever reason things kind of they weren't apocalyptic, they weren't great, but they weren't apocalyptic, that living in such a way would actually still be beneficial and would still be a nice way to be in relation with my community and with the wider world. Why am I still not doing it? Why am I not putting my money where my mouth is, so to speak? And I don't know what that is exactly. I don't know if it's a sort of a feeling of activating the future, in a sense. There's a difference between intellectually knowing a thing and then doing a thing, isn't there? It really means that what I think is coming, I feel is coming. You're opening yourself up for those avenues of fear, I suppose. Like, do you have any insight into that as to what helps push people over the edge into taking action?
It's very difficult. I mean, I think it's just determination ultimately. Like, I think it's forms of determination. I think about going to Thacker Pass, for example, and it was a very, very difficult thing to decide to do, even though at that point I'd been involved in direct action and, grassroots social work and community organizing and protests and all that kind of stuff for 10 years or 15 years. Making the decision to pack up and go set up camp on the side of a mountain, 9 hours drive from home in the middle of nowhere, and like hope that something good comes of it and just pour the energy into it. Like, it's a leap of faith. It really is. And we went out there thinking like, this could be over in a few weeks and nobody ever knows that it happened. Yeah. Like, it could do nothing, it could be a complete failure. And you have to be willing to fail. You have to be willing to try and fail. And I think, another example that comes to mind sort of looking at building is my friend Kara here locally. She's a permaculturist, permaculture educator, has a little farm over here. And, she's like, Kara's been a working class poor person her whole life. Like, she doesn't have any money. She and her community figured out how to get this little piece of land, through pooling their money and doing all this work, 10 or 15 years ago. And she has since poured her life into creating this like oasis of life and biodiversity there. And she, for her, it's not about, she takes it very seriously. She's the person who's coordinating with people throughout the whole region to save seeds and grow increasingly climate heat adapted varieties.
Oh, interesting.
Because she's like, my children aren't going to have food unless we get this right, and we need to start 50 years ago or long. She takes it very seriously. It's not a hobby project. It's not, this is something that I dabble in. She's like, this industrial food system that we rely upon is going to collapse soon. Yeah. Sometime in the coming couple of decades. Yeah. And it's not going to work. And unless we prepare now, we're not going to have food and we're all going to die. And she will say that. She's like very blunt about this and very straightforward. And it's incredibly refreshing to me because my stereotype of the permaculture community was always like, beautiful, happy hippies who want to all get along and do ecstatic dance and grow some nice food for the potluck, Like, sorry, permaculture people, but you've got a reputation. Hopefully you'll forgive me. But she brings this very hard-headed attitude to it, And she's just like, look, this is not a game. This isn't a hobby. Like, this is deadly serious stuff that we're doing here. And so she's like researching what tree varieties are likely to be able to survive and thrive, like nut-producing trees, food trees, are likely to be able to survive and thrive in the climate conditions that are expected under the different warming scenarios that are projected for our region in 30 years, in 50 years. And she's planting those now and trying to figure out which ones survive and which don't. Okay, let's take grafts and seeds from the ones who survive. Let's cross them with others. Let's try and keep that genetic line going. Let's try and build those genetics up. And then once we get something that's successful, let's share that out to all the other projects across the region that are doing similar things.
Brilliant.
So that it's a serious, she would be a great guest for the show, actually. She's taking these things very seriously, and she looks at community building as part of this because a lot of people like to stereotype permaculture as being about growing food and gardening. And I sort of do that myself. That's how it's colloquially used. But really, you go back to the origins of it, that's not what it's about at all. That's one part of a larger system that's saying, how do we live in place sustainably over time? And so people talk about social permaculture. It's like, how do we create the human ecology of our relationships to each other, the way that we live, the way that we interact, the way that we sort of negotiate our different needs and desires in a way that we can live together in peace, in harmony, because you can't live sustainably unless you have some balance, unless you have some stability. So yeah, she's really brilliant. And I look at people who are doing amazing things across the world, and there are these people who are just fucking gonna do it. Like I heard from a friend a while ago that these are some acronyms that come out of the British military, which you can critique, for a lot of different reasons, but I appreciated the acronyms. One was PLF, which is persistent little fucker. And like, we need to be PLFs. We need to be serious, and we need to be dedicated, and we need to get it done.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of admiration for the people who just make things happen. And, when they encounter an obstacle, they just say, you know what? Okay, we're going to go around it. We're going to find another path. We're going to go over it. We're going to go through it. We're going to figure out a way.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do. We're unfortunately living in this time where we're all very much, we live in a coddled age, and we're not used to very much hardship and very much difficulty. And there's going to be a lot of that coming. And if we want to effectively resist and effectively build alternatives to the system, we're going to just have to push.
Yeah.
And have a lot of determination.
And I think these exit strategies allow you to keep resisting more. And that's something that's sort of slightly overlooked, especially by the sort of, how do I put this? Maybe some of the bigger names that are sort of talking about the future and talking about sustainability, et cetera, are very much embedded in the continuation, essentially, of things in some form, with the belief that you can just swap out one energy system for another. And what we saw traveling through Colombia was that part of the reason that people want to keep a hold of their land is their traditions. This is what they know how to do. They want to provide for their communities. They want to continue growing their own food. But also, it is that very thing that allows them to keep resisting the pull of urbanization, wage slavery, and a sense of a loss of control over their future, to the extent that they don't know how they would be able to provide for their children, i.e. there's nothing that they could offer their children apart from this path of also going into wage slavery, essentially. And the small pieces of land that these people have, just the capacity to grow their own food. And it really is that, like, they're not, some communities we spoke with were building their own shelters on these lands. But generally speaking, we're talking about, towns that are being run on diesel and, modern people have Wi-Fi and electricity, just sort of any sort of rural place. But the fact that they can sustain themselves, that they have a subsistence economy, essentially allows them to keep resisting these forces of empire, these corporate arms that are reaching in and want to penetrate them. And that, I think, is a really interesting way of understanding as well what it would be to invest in that kind of future that we think is coming, or the kind of future that we would like to see. Is it adds armor. It's not just that you're kind of banking in a way on like the worst happening. It's not that at all. Even if things don't particularly change, even if this crumbling takes generations and generations, you are adding armor to yourself and to the generations that follow you, with regards to how you can resist it. And for me, something that's been really helpful, and I would really encourage people to go and, get a book on this, is like understanding how deeply political and social the lives of peasants were. Not just like this image that we have of like backbreaking work and being a serf and all this kind of stuff, but like the way that communal life revolved around the commons and living together and being political together by way of gathering in a space and growing one's own food, and the relationship that they had to different pockets of land, and like even the standing of women. Silvia Federici's work, the standing of women in peasant society, like the less of a sexual division of labor. Like it's not this sort of like necessarily backwards way of living, and you only have to travel around places in the world where there are still proud peasant farmers to show like it is for many a form of autonomy. And so a return to something like that would almost be like a return to a body politic that goes so much further than just turning out to the polls every 4 years, but actually is involved in the democratic decisions of governance in your environment, in the place that you are. And I think that's a really important thing that helps people kind of push forward into the possibility of what could come from, you know, putting your money where your mouth is, essentially.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rachel. And it's, you know, I mean, look at the MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil, which has been like one of the world's most powerful social movements for a couple decades now, at least. And, you know, and I've been studying the Luddites for many years and reading about them. And, you know, they're another example of what you're talking about, of a community of sort of craftspeople who, in their case, they faced the influx of this new technology that was dehumanizing, that, you know, sort of in parallel to AI today, was forcing people out of their jobs, was sort of flattening this dynamic social structure that had evolved over a long time, where you had guilds and you had apprentices, and, you know, it was a slower pace of life, and people could work in their own homes and with their families and choose their own hours and so on. And instead, it just became regimented. It became factory work. It became, you know, if you make any trouble, we'll just fire you because we don't need skilled labor. Like, we can have anyone come in here and do this. And, you know, I just read a book as well. It's called China's Engine of Environmental Collapse. Kind of a stunning book, brutal. And in that book, he talks extensively about what you could call forced proletarianization of Chinese peasants, of how many of these communities, which were formerly agricultural communities that had existed for hundreds, thousands of years, were forced off their land in China, not through choice, not because they wanted opportunity in the cities. Sure, there was a bit of that here and there, but many of them because the land was being privatized, because it was being turned to mines, because they were building a superhighway through, because they're building a dam and they're going to displace 30 million people to flood the new reservoir. You know, and this has happened all over the world. You know, it's happened in India, it happened in, you know, it happened in the UK, it happened here in the United States. You know, that's in many cases what the wars against the indigenous people in North America really was, in a sense, it was removing people from the land and then forcing them onto reservations where they didn't have the ability to be self-sufficient and provide for themselves. And so now they have to work in a wage economy, you know, and that's forced proletarianization. It's the creation of a proletarian class that's reliant upon wage labor where none existed beforehand, where people were self-sufficient beforehand. And that, you know, like enclosure of the commons is such an important piece of this whole thing. And I know you were talking about Silvia Federici earlier before we started the recording, you know, and she wrote extensively about that and the relationship between patriarchy and the oppression of women and this sort of enclosure of the commons, you know, movement that was so destructive in European history. And, you know, and just to bring it back to where we were before, like there's such a barrier of skills here too, because I live in a little bit of a rural area. You know, I don't own the land here, we rent it, but there's some land. But I don't know how to provide for myself entirely off this land, you know? And that's the difference between me and those landless peasants in the MST in Brazil, or the folks who you were talking about in Colombia, is that if you actually have the unbroken tradition of this is how we provide for ourselves, this is how you do it, this is how you save seed, this is how you forage, this is how you live from the land, and how you do it for your family and in a community, and then doing it as an individual, isolated and without skills, it feels completely impossible. And so there's like this generational gap that's been created where once that chain of knowledge and skills is broken, it's very, very hard to get it back. And, you know, I don't really know how to overcome that challenge beyond just person by person study, learning, practice. trying to move forward. But it sure seems like those type of skills are going to be in more and more high demand, going forward. Yeah.
It's like that thing about creation and destruction again. And those knowledge systems took literally thousands of years to generate. And then figuring out how to distill them in story form, myth, practice. It takes one generation to lose all of that, knowledge web. And then how long does it take to build it back up? And we are in a particularly good situation with regards to it because of the availability of information, because of the sort of professionalization even of research. Like we know how to research quickly, well, correctly. And so it is possible for people to learn it in that way. But then learning it in that way is so divorced from how we learned it as well for those thousands of years. And then then it's again that process of figuring out, like, how do you get it from those, how do you move it those 12 inches? You can learn that knowledge, but how do you move it down there to the heart? And then be able to figure out how to teach it in such a way that it can spread like wildfire, essentially. And I think that is particularly difficult for the ancestors of, empire, descendants of empire, sorry. And does mean that, again, and this is sort of circling back to something we've already said, but the wealthiest among us, the luckiest, quote unquote, among us will fight to preserve these violent systems on some level if those violent systems are what's providing the food and the shelter. I was walking down the street the other day and I just went, they stole our land. They stole our land. They stole our land. They stole our land.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that the kind of generational analysis stops like 500 years ago, essentially.
Yeah.
It happened to Europeans as well. It happened to, there were cultures that were eradicated. There were peoples that were eradicated. Not in the same way, not with the same levels or infliction of violence completely. But, but
what were the Romans doing?
Yeah.
In Gaul. I mean, it's the same thing that the Americans were doing in North America, essentially.
Yeah.
They were civilizing the savages at the point of the sword,
I think it's, when it comes to sort of building class consciousness, class relations, solidarity, and getting rid of those divisions that capitalism fundamentally relies upon in order to reproduce itself, then that history of how these practices were first honed at home before being exported out and exploited even further is a really important part of this question as to how we move forward together.
Yeah, and there's a great book, Noel Ignatiev, I think is the guy's name, something like that. How the Irish became white, and it's U.S. history.
Wow.
But it's about the Irish immigrants to the U.S. and they weren't white when they came here. They were not considered white at all. They were discriminated against heavily. I mean, of course, early on there were many indentured servants from England who were basically slaves in at least for periods of time. But he writes about that sort of process of assimilation into the ruling class of empire and how it sort of happens somewhat by choice, somewhat not. There's all this wrapped up in that process. And you can kind of see that, there's sort of a give and take on that happening right now, I think, in the US around like certain Latino populations. There's sort of like in Florida, for example, there's like the right-wing Cubans who've been like very conservative and capitalist and kind of working to assimilate themselves into the power structure for many years. And you see in the Trump administration, I think you see this sort of multicultural white supremacism in a way that, is kind of destabilizing to the old narrative that just sees a very clear color line and like you're racist if you're on one side. And, that's much simpler, but it's not that way anymore. It's become a lot more flexible. And this is why, Trump can go to the Philippines and go talk to Duterte when he was president or dictator, and talk about how much he admires Duterte and what he does and so on. And then, and he can go talk to Bukele, in El Salvador and have this great relationship with him, and then come back here to the US and sort of spout this incredibly racist rhetoric against immigrants coming from El Salvador, among other places. Yeah. And it's this flexibility of white supremacy, of racism, of these systems of oppression that allows them to, there's an old quote, I think it was from Gail Dines, I'm looking for her right now, who is a feminist activist, and she was talking about how systems of oppression are flexible enough to absorb some members of subordinated groups. Indeed, they draw strength from the illusion of neutrality provided by these exceptions. And, that, I don't really know how we got on this topic, but our conversations tend to wander a little bit. And I think it's an important piece of all this, because you see systems of oppression, xenophobia, racism, patriarchy, all of these strategies of othering being used to maintain and expand empire, being used to kind of maintain the legitimacy of the ruling class against the barbarian outsiders. And this is, I think, only going to become more and more sort of critical and dangerous in the future. I mean, we're already seeing what's coming of it, which is what's come of it in the past, which is the same trajectory. It's genocide. It's inhumane treatment. It's torture. It's war. It's all of these terrible things that are happening. And I think the answer to that is solidarity. The answer to that is, as you were saying a minute ago, it's in building the radical class consciousness that acknowledges our differences and builds cultures of respect and understanding around them, that doesn't erase them, but focuses and builds power and strength and relationship on what we do share and where we do overlap and how we can build and grow together. And, I can say from organizing myself over the years, that's one of the biggest challenges to effective resistance, to effectively building alternatives, to effectively working together on any collaborative projects, political projects in this day and age, is this culture of suspicion and mistrust and fear and xenophobia and hate that has infected all of us to a greater or lesser extent, and that is very, very challenging to overcome, because it's based on very real things. It's based on everything that we see in the news. And, we have a lot of reason to mistrust each other. It's not a stupid thing to do. And yet at the same time, I feel like we need this principled solidarity with each other where we collaborate across differences. And, this to me, I just read Norman Finkelstein, the brilliant scholar of Palestinian history and Israeli genocide. His most recent book before October 7th was about identity politics, and it's kind of an intense book. Like, a lot of people are going to read it and be like, "Wow, this guy sucks." But it's a very powerful book because he's bringing this sort of old left perspective. He's probably, 75 or something now? He's getting up there. But one of the things he says in the book is, like, people look back at these old left organizations at the 60s and the 70s and people fighting empire and working for revolution and so on. And they say, we didn't pay enough attention to race and gender and sex and these different oppressions. And he says, we actually did pay a lot of attention to them. The difference was that we focused on what our overlaps were and what our similarities were. We focused on the solidarity aspects, not to minimize or invisibilize or get rid of the differences and the things that divide us and the systems of oppression that exist even within our own communities and our relationships. But we work on that stuff, we acknowledge it, and then we try and move forward together, together in a positive way. And that's really one of my, it's a place where I feel a lot of grief, as somebody who's worked in social movements for like 15 years, is I feel like I've just seen it get worse over that time in our ability to work together well. And it's really, really hard. Yeah. It's really difficult to face that. But it's not impossible. I'm sort of letting my morose side get the best of me for a moment. Woe is me. I'm so sad. But it's not impossible. And that's the thing, is like when we do it, it's so joyful, and it's such a beautiful thing to be able to connect with people who are different from me and different from you, and to work together across those differences. And there's always going to be challenges with that, but that's how we build, and that's how we learn, and that's how we get past the stereotypes and the inculcation of these oppressive mindsets. That's how we build in a positive direction, I think, is we connect with other human beings, and then we take action together, and that takes faith, and that faith will be tested. It will be challenged, but I think we have to keep going, I wrote an essay several years ago about my grandmother, and my grandma was this pretty amazing woman, my mom's mom. She was an artist, and she was towards the end of her life. She's like in her 80s and 90s, and she's walking around wearing all this like crazy colorful clothing and amazing, shockingly contrasting polka dots and red basketball shoes and like 40 necklaces. And she wore her art in part too. But somebody asked her, "What do you believe in?" one time, and they were trying to get like a religious answer or something from her, and her answer was, "I believe in art and I believe in people." And so I wrote an essay about that, and I was just reflecting on what that meant. And to me, to say one believes in art is like to say one believes in beauty, like the beauty of the world, the beauty that exists in this existence, in this experience that we get to have, whether that's the beauty of, art, quote unquote, art on the wall, a painting, a sculpture, something like that. But what about the art of a butterfly's coloration, or, the curve of a river, or, the beautiful shade cast by an oak tree on a hot summer day, or the smile of a newborn child, or the laugh of your best friend, or, a kiss from your lover, or like all the beauty in the world, all the art in the world, the bite, the taste of an incredibly delicious meal. Like, to believe in art, I think, is to believe in like beauty and goodness and rightness, and that things can be good in the world, and that those things are worth believing in and working towards and having faith in. And then she said, "I believe in people." That was the second part. And that one was really hard for me for a long time, because I think, like so many of us, it's really easy to be misanthropic in this world. It's really easy to not trust, to not be open, to, just shut yourself down emotionally and spiritually and energetically to other human beings, because people do a lot of fucked up stuff, and we hurt each other, and we make terrible mistakes, and we do it over and over and over again. But, to me, like, how do you find faith in people despite that? How do you find faith in people's ability to change? How do you find faith in our ability to evolve over time? Maybe not an individual, but a population, a community, to grow beyond old ways of being, to shift our ways of thinking, our ways of being and acting. And yeah, so that's really stuck with me from my grandma, something that I reflect on a lot.
I think that, as you say, it is very easy to be relatively misanthropic. And I think it's also all right, in a sense, to raise the bar on what it is that we seek to receive and give in our relationships, and to, rather than accept this sort of like cult of the entitled individual who extracts consciously or subconsciously from bodies around the world in order to feed their vision of, you know, whatever it is that life should be or is or whatever. It's all right to reject that. It's all right to say that is shit and I'm not interested. And it feels like it's everywhere. As long
Absolutely.
as you stay open to the possibility that there are other forms of being and they are already being enacted. And there are brilliant people. But something, because this is something I've sort of struggled with over the past year, and I really thought about, like, how is it that I engage with people around me? Because I find that there's almost like, I used to think of it as this, that there were almost like two Rachels. There was this like really open one, and then increasingly this like quite hard one. This steel is coming out of me as I enter into my 30s. And I've reconciled it in the sense of rather than accepting that the culture be dumbed down, that we constantly go towards the lowest common denominator, dumbed down intellectually, dumbed down emotionally, dumbed down physically, you know, that it's all right to reject that and still aim up and to seek to reach out to those other people who are also seeking the way up. That it's not a fundamentally kind of like, it's not I'm rabbiting here, but I am trying to get to something, that it's not about the arrogance of thinking that one deserves better, but the faith in people that we can do better, to both have steel and resist, and like openness and softness to move forward together. And it's a hard balance to strike, but I think it is an important one because it keeps you sane. Because some people are shit.
It is, yeah. It is, yeah. And I think, you know, for me, there's been an evolution there too, very parallel to what you're talking about, Rachel, because I think the older that I've come to be, the more I've learned that setting boundaries and having, you know, very clear boundaries, whether that's on a personal level or on a planetary level. Like, I have a boundary that destroying the world through global warming is not okay with me.
Yeah.
And I will, if you try and do it, I will try to stop you using all power at my disposal, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a boundary.
Yeah.
And there's a parallel between that between any personal boundary and that larger political or planetary boundary. And I have learned that a boundary can be very clear, strong, firm, assertive, that a boundary can even use force, can even use what we would call violence, and yet can not come from a place of hate, right? Or that it doesn't have to be that hardness. It doesn't have to come from the place of hardening oneself. It can come from a place of love and softness and gentleness, but it can manifest in this action that might be sort of coded in a very different way by observers or by a simple summary of it. And I think the difference between those two, like my old friend Saba Malik, she's a great friend of mine, and she's Pakistani. And years ago, she traveled to Pakistan and she went into the Hunza Valley, which is this remote part of Pakistan. I think it's in the Karakoram Mountains. And it's been a pretty isolated community for a very long time, very self-sufficient. And she was there probably, 30 years ago or something. So I'm sure it's globalized quite a bit since then. But she talked about how, you know, in the community there, they had various rules for sustainability about, like, if anyone's going to cut down a tree, there has to be a meeting about it. And there's a discussion, you know, you don't get just cut down a tree. She talked about how she developed a bit of a relationship with this one elder who lived on a path that she was walking kind of repeatedly. They'd talk and they talk about all kinds of stuff. He showed her a People magazine one time, and he said, I can't even read English, but just by looking at the pictures of these people, I know that this culture you come from is crazy. But one of the other things that they started talking about was they were talking about how the community there has fought off invaders many times over the centuries, as many sort of mountain communities, hill peoples have throughout history, sort of maintaining their fierce independence and self-sufficiency, trying not to get their land taken and be forced into peasantry or servitude for others, sort of serfdom. And Saba's response as a young 20-year-old or something was something along the lines of, but if you use violence, you become just like them. And his response, this elder's response to her was, the difference is that our people here know when to pick their weapons up and they know when to put them down. And that was, I've thought about that a lot. She's thought about it a lot over the years. She's shared that story many times with me. And it's just so interesting, because what is sort of modern business capitalism, industrial capitalism around the world, but sort of the weaponization of commerce. It's like not knowing when to put it down, not knowing when you have enough, right? Yeah. And, what is sort of patriarchy and imperialism and all these different expressions of domination and violence, but it's like not knowing when to put it down, not knowing when to put the gun down or the sword down, and that becoming a pathological state that you're always in, this state of violence and the state of taking and aggression and domination. But of course, communities and people throughout history have used force and have used violence to defend themselves forever. Like, Native communities here in North America, like, if you weren't in your village, like, you'd pretty much be carrying a weapon with you at all times. It was not an unusual thing for people to defend themselves and defend their communities. But it was managed very differently. I was just reading a writer friend of mine was talking about, he's Native, he's Cherokee, and he was talking about how in his community's tradition and in many Native communities, the communities were actually led and guided by councils of elder women. And so the young men would actually be the warriors. They'd be the ones who'd go out and fight if fighting was needed, but they wouldn't do it unless they were told to do so by the elder women. Yeah. And when the elder women said, the fighting's done, then the fighting was done, and they put their weapons down. And that's why so much of the warfare and the raiding between tribes in North America prior to colonization, not entirely, of course, but most of it was characterized by small-scale raids, sort of tit for tat. It was much more sort of jockeying for position, establishing boundaries, being clear about, no, we're not okay if you do that, and there will be consequences if you continue, rather than, sort of these wars of conquest and domination and extermination that became the norm. So, I think that we can get back to that. And I think that as we're living in this era of cascading collapse, converging meta-crisis, we are in a time where it's so important for us all to set clear boundaries on a planetary level and then work to enforce those collectively.
Yeah. Max, I think that is where we should leave it. And I think we should come back to it in about a year's time and continue this conversation and see how your actual work with the communities and direct action is informing that. Because I completely agree with you. I think that there cannot be defense without self-defense. And if our bodies are interconnected biological members of an ecosystem, then defense of the Earth's body is defense of our body. And even in our legal systems, we have the right to self-defense, and we have the right to defend each other. I just want to leave people with this, because I only discovered it recently, that if, for example, you are under attack and somebody who loves you steps in and kills that person, for example, that qualifies as self-defense. So even our law speaks to the interconnection, the ecosystems of our bodies, to our selfhood as communal. And I think that it seems rather obvious that be applied to the body upon which we all depend, Earth's body.
Absolutely.
So.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to your book on this topic. Maybe next time we talk, I'll be interviewing you about that.
Thank you, Max. This was really delightful. Thank you again. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I think I mentioned her name and her work so much in this interview that I think it's got to be my friend, Kara Hunter Moon. She runs a small permaculture community in this area that's called Horticulture Farm. And she's quite brilliant. And like I said, hard-headed, somebody who's doing some incredibly amazing, gritty, on-the-ground work. And she's also not somebody to shy away from all these topics that we're talking about. She's going to be the first one to say that the empire needs to fall. And, she bucks the stereotypes that too often have a tidbit of truth in them about, permaculture people kind of
ecstatic dance.
Being a little too divorced, I think, from the political reality of our situation.
Yeah.
I mean, Toby Hemingway, one of the founders of permaculture, said, this is a revolution disguised as gardening. And what I've said about permaculture many times before is we need to drop the disguise. And Kara is really somebody who does that.
Excellent. Well, I really look forward to speaking with her. Max, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed today.
Thanks a lot, Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.